Texas.
The gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from California, and I couldn't agree more with his characterization. And I've got a photo here. I'm not going to turn it around because it's got the faces of kids in it, but it was just sent to me just today from the county attorney from a county in South Texas that has a photo with two little kids, probably in the sort of 2 to 4 age range, jammed into the back of a vehicle, packed to the brim, smugglers running the car, and they. This is the status. Is the normal course of operations going on in the South Texas all the time. We're encouraging this. Our country, the supposedly greatest, most powerful, strongest country in the world, is encouraging this. The last time I was down at the border, I go probably about every couple of months, down at the river, talking to people coming, and almost every single person that I talked to were saying they wanted to come here for a better way of life. And God bless them. I mean, I absolutely admire them desire to want to come here for a better way of life. But any of them weren't coming to me saying, oh, you know, I'm coming here because I'm afraid of what was happening to me and whatever it was, whatever. They wanted a job. They wanted opportunity. And I do not begrudge that. But we are allowing them to be used. We are. That's what we're doing. We are allowing them to be used by cartels for profit. And yes, some of them aren't paying cartels.
Would the gentleman
Some of
yield?
them are moving. I might yield in a minute, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with, is that we're setting up a situation where the little girl that I was talking to, I then broke off and talked to the two boys that were right behind her, and I asked them, where were you last night? And they were spending the night in the park across the Rio Grande. And I asked them, did anything bad happen to that girl? And both the little boys said, yes. And she was a 14-year-old girl, give or take. And they said she was sexually abused. I was talking to them in my broken Spanish. That's what they told me. Now, he said, oh, you're making that up. No, this is the reality of what happens down there. We talk to the people in the law enforcement and Border Patrol and the people down there all the time. That is no way for us to do business. You know, we can set up systems for people to be able to avail themselves of legal paths to come here. We can open our hearts, open our arms to help people to claim asylum legitimately. But you cannot have a system that is utter chaos when you have 7.7 billion other people around the world who, of course, would love to come to this country. I yield back to the chairman. I'm sorry, I used up my time.
Time has expired. Gentlelady from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roy, I actually agree with much of what you have said. I speak to migrants all the time. Obviously, I live in El Paso. El Paso has been the epicenter for some time. We had the highest number of encounters in 2022, and we are already slated to have the highest number of encounters in 2023. I speak to the migrants every time that I can. And you're absolutely right. I have seen a shift, more and more migrants who are not claiming persecution, but would like an economic opportunity. Could not agree with you more. It is more and more unsustainable over time. And the longer that Congress does nothing, the worse it will become. Where you and I do not agree, but where I wish we could find common ground is, I think, number one, we have to acknowledge this is not the fault of one person. I mean, I have lived in my community all my life. I have volunteered to help migrants since I was in my 20s. I'm now 53 years old. So this has been going on my entire life. Has it gotten more pronounced? Yes, 1,000% it has. It's been steadily growing since 2014. What we need to do is recognize that part of the answer, And I'm with you. I believe we've got to have strong enforcement. We've got to know who's coming into our country. We've got to have as much security and safety as possible. But one avenue for getting there is legal pathways. And that's where we are not speaking to each other in a way to find some unity. But I guarantee you, Mr. Roy, that if we open up some
Point of order. The
pathways,
gentlelady is to direct her comments to the chair.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I guarantee you, if we were to work together on finding legal pathways, in addition to enforcement mechanisms, I think you would find unity and bipartisan support. So I want to express that I want to solve this. I want to address this. I don't think the status quo is humane. I think it is incredibly inhumane. But I think because what we have been doing is the same thing over and over and over again, building walls, seeking deterrence, let's try a new path. And that new path is opening up legal pathways. And I'll work with you on that every day of the week. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to take a moment to observe some of the findings of a Florida grand jury that had been convened on this subject. And what the grand jury found was that children are often treated to the most perilous of journeys as a consequence of policy decisions that allowed them to be released into the interior of the country. And so what this Florida grand jury did was they reviewed thousands of documents from our Department of Children and Families, from our Health and Human Services agencies, from our safety net organizations, and they issued a scathing report asking essentially the Congress to choose a different path than that has been chosen by the Biden administration. And so I want to take a moment to reflect on some of those findings in the record. Quote, "Our findings are clear. If any Florida resident exposed U.S.-born children to this process, they would justifiably be arrested for child neglect or worse. We do not think children should be less protected simply because they were born outside our borders and brought here by a government agency. Those here in Florida who are sending money and other aid to facilitate this process should know what they are funding. At nearly every juncture, travelers forging the Darien Gap and other notorious routes must pay handlers, armed militia groups, native tribes, local warlords, gangs, or drug cartels in order to obtain safe passage. In many cases, the toll is exacted in lives, labor, or sexual abuse. They face disease, famine, drought, a perilous jungle trek, insects, and predators, both human and animal. One child disclosed that during her journey, several of her group were robbed and attacked by rival gang members, decapitated, and raped. The child disclosed that she was one of the victims of that rape. Grand juries are not political entities. They are sourced from regular folks who review evidence, and perhaps this body, ever so partisan in addressing the issue, would glean some clarity from what we are hearing. The critique of our government from the grand jury was this: armed with a budget of billions of taxpayer dollars and working with activists and nonprofit organizations, which receive hundreds of millions of dollars in grant monies, hold millions in assets, and pay cadres of executive salaries in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, is handling thousands of foreign children in a dangerous manner. This is a nonpartisan analysis from a grand jury in my state, deeply concerned about the way these decisions that the Biden administration is making is affecting these children. And, Mr. Chairman, I seek that all of the findings and presentments of the Florida grand jury on unaccompanied children be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
And I thank the gentleman from Florida, and I thank you for making those points. And look, and I'll say to the gentlelady from El Paso that I take her words to heart, and I'd be happy to have conversations about what we can do going forward. I think where we disagree, as you laid out, is I have come to the conclusion observationally, having worked on this issue as a staffer for John Cornyn, a staffer for Ted Cruz, as someone who was working for Governor Perry at the time this was being debated, then now having seen it now up close and personally, and I was working as a lawyer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, there are multiple of those debates, is that we have to do this sequentially, in my view. Now, you might disagree, but I'm just giving you sort of an idea of how you, in my view, how you do this. In my opinion, you have to establish that you're going to enforce the rule of law. And the example of your predecessor, Sylvester Reyes, right, was a part of building infrastructure and fencing in El Paso. And I'm directing my remarks, I guess, inappropriately not to the chair, but through the chair, I would argue that the predecessor of the gentlelady from El Paso worked on building the fence there.
Would you yield 10 seconds?
I will yield, yes, ma'am.
No, he
To
can't.
the chair.
No, it's not my time.
It's my time.
All right, I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
I have a series of additional unanimous consent requests, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman.
From the New York Times, April 17, 2020. I'm sorry, from the New York Times, as migrant children were put to work, U.S. ignored warnings.
Without objection.
New York Times, February 25th, 2023, alone and exploited, migrant children work brutal jobs across the United States.
Without objection.
New York Post, March 22nd, 2021, Mexican drug cartels use kids as decoys to smuggle in members.
Without objection.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word, and I yield to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline, and not to Mr. Roy, but to the chair. This is precisely what we've been doing for 3 decades. For 3 decades, we have said no immigration reform until the border is secure. That's a fact. And so we've not had in 30 years, over 30 years, any new legal pathways. The closest we came was about a decade ago, and the Senate passed a bipartisan bill that would have secured historic sums for border security and at the same time opened up legal pathways, and it died in the House at that time. And so we've been pursuing that same policy of let's do enforcement only first, and then once the border is quote unquote secure, then we will do immigration reform. And so my contention is, and I think the facts support it, we have seen over the past 30 years a closing off of legal pathways. We've had walls built. We now fund DHS at historic levels. We have seen all sorts of deterrent policies at play. None of that has truly stemmed the flow of people in a way that would make it more manageable. And as I mentioned in some earlier comments, we've created one pathway for migrants, and that one pathway is asylum. So we should not be shocked that the asylum system is overwhelmed, overloaded, overused, because that's the only line people can get into. That's the only right way that many people see for themselves. I don't believe that we can take, even if we could, we shouldn't take every person, obviously. But if we want to create a more manageable system, it has to be a combination of both of those, not just one before the other. And I yield back to Mr. Cicilline.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, now I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, for my time.
Gentleman from Texas.
Let's strike the last word. And to the gentlelady, what I would say is 2006, comprehensive immigration reform, which touched all aspects, security, future flow, status. 2007, 2012-13, 2018, multiple attempts by both parties in diverging places in the House and the Senate to work on various forms of, quote, comprehensive immigration reform, all of which the bow broke. Okay, no matter what your perspective is on what we should have had or not should have had in those bills, all of which the bow ultimately broke. And the point is that we've not been able to do that. I've come to the conclusion that the biggest reason why is because we have a large block of the American people who, with a very good reason, don't believe we're actually serious about securing the border in the first instance. That's the fundamental problem. And when I brought up Mr. Reyes, your predecessor, the gentlelady's predecessor. My point is, it's a Democrat, former congressman from Texas who was a part of building infrastructure that actually did a pretty good job of stopping some of the problems that El Paso was dealing with the flow. Is it a total panacea? Of course not. But when you have policies as we do today, and the gentlelady had said something about it's not just blaming one person. I mean, okay, fair enough. I agree. We've got years of things that have led to this. But you cannot help but look at a chart of the numbers of what we've seen since January of 21 and see a direct correlation to the policy choices of the current administration in terms of what they did with migrant protection protocols in January, basically making it very clear how that would work. And if you come to the United States and claim asylum, say asylum, you'll get processed and released immediately. NGOs will move you around the country. We all know this is true. We've all been to tent facilities along the border. We see the processing. When that happens and you have a flood of people, again, remember Jay Johnson under President Obama. What was it? 1,000 a week was a crisis. What did we just have in March? 200,000. And that doesn't even include the parole numbers that were done through, I think, illegally, using a case-by-case basis to run those numbers up. So you're really looking at 230, 240. And so these numbers just blow the lid off of Jay Johnson and Barack Obama. I mean, Jay Johnson was at least credibly, in my opinion, trying to say, let's hold the line, secure the border, and not invite a flood at the border. My point being, these policies matter. And so we should try to set the standard for the world to say, here's how you're going to do it. And it's not just asylum. You got 1 million people getting green cards. There's that path. Do I think we need to adjust how we deal with future flow and deal with immigration? Absolutely. Do I think we need to have some possibilities for guest worker programs to make it work and match tech and skills and ag? Of course. I don't know anybody on this side of the aisle disagrees. But every time we try, we never get security. And every time we try to touch chain migration or family, we get blown out of the water. And we can't actually reform the system.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you so much. And here's what I would share with you. First and foremost, yes, one of my predecessors was a Border Patrol agent who supported comprehensive immigration reform, number one.
And building the wall.
And yes, actually you're right, he did. But the second thing that I would share with you is if you look at the data, and we really, I will share with you the data from the CBP, the numbers, we know for a fact that during the Trump administration, the numbers began growing. We know that. I visited and I brought 20% of Congress to El Paso to see the overcrowded facilities because the numbers were so high. The numbers dropped precipitously in March of 2020 for a few months. That coincided with COVID when the border was shut down, and the numbers
reclaiming my time.
The numbers started going back up before the November
reclaiming
election.
my time because we got about 35 seconds left. The fact of the matter is, the numbers that were spiking were dealt with by the previous administration, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not like that, but those numbers plummeted. They plummeted, and it wasn't COVID. It was not COVID. There were significant, clear results from the policies that were adopted that stopped the magnet for people coming to the river. That's very clear from anybody we talked to at Border Patrol. And so happy to talk sidebar on that, but that's the fact. We had a flood. Trump dealt with it. We've got to not have the policies that are continuing to attract people, and that's what this bill's about.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Move to strike the last word very, very quickly. When we speak about the walls and the walls that were built, remember, most of them were not completely built. The program would have been much more successful. Just particularly what I saw even in Arizona and Yuma, if that wall was complete, if any of the walls were complete, we'd be in much safer and better shape. And that was something that Republicans and Democrats both agreed upon. So we can't use the walls as an example of a failure because we never really got to where we should be.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
You know, one of the other things that was just brought up that I think the two members were sort of batting back and forth, you know, they did say that the rate was rising when President Trump left office and he was dealing with it. But I heard that it went down because of COVID. When you came here, when did COVID end? Did it end on the day that President Biden took office and it spiked? So the rise during COVID is what we're talking about here today, isn't it?
Exactly, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding.
No problem. I yield.
And those numbers started dropping. And yes, of course, 20 was an impact, but those numbers dropped precipitously as a result of those policies in the fall of 19, heading into 20. President Biden takes office, adopts the policies the president adopted, and those numbers spike off the chart. Policies matter. They have consequences. I yield back to the gentleman from